Location is an incredibly important part of a film, and I think it's often overlooked, especially if you're low on budget. But the truth is that if you have no money but access to an amazing location, it can make all the difference. And just think of all the different ways that you've seen, say, offices portrayed on screen. You know, an office is like the most bland space possible, and yet in movies there's this endless variation on what it is and what it could look like. The locations that your characters inhabit say a huge amount about them. So because of that, just alone, it's really important to think carefully about location. And of course, then there's all the problems that you get with actually making the movie, which is another really important part of scouting. You probably know all that, but how to actually scout a location properly is very rarely talked about. So here's me and producer of Personal Effects, Evangeline Williams, going to British seaside town Broadstairs to find locations. Location scouting starts at the idea stage, really, of pre-production. Evie and me knew that we needed a beach for the flashback sequence of our film. I'd made a mood board, and more on that on a previous episode of this series, which had lots of seaside town shots, so we had something to work from. One of those is actually in America, one of them is in the UK, but it's too far away from other locations. We also knew that we needed a town close by to the beach for some shots, which ruled out a lot of other possibilities for beautiful, but more isolated beaches. So to recap, we need a location that's close enough to our base, which is London, and has a seaside town instead of just a beach. And that meant that we could narrow it down to a couple of options, which was Cromer, which is this gorgeous Victorian seaside town in Norfolk, and Broadstairs, which is this gorgeous Victorian seaside town in Kent. In the end, Broadstairs won out pretty much because it was closer. So while scouting, we had 4 main locations to identify, which was somewhere on the beach, a nearby sheltered area, a winding street for the characters to walk up, and a place to park a car for a key scene that's set in one. The beach was relatively easy, as you might imagine. There's plenty of options to choose from. We also found a couple of places for the sheltered areas, and then we could make our choices based off things like light and access. The difficult ones were the car and the street, which might surprise you because there's plenty of those in a town. So I'm going to walk you through our search for a simple place to park a car to illustrate how complex location scouting can be and why that's sometimes surprising. So in this scene, the main character and her older brother sit in a parked car and listen to music. I wanted to be able to see the sea through the windows of the car, which basically ruled out anywhere too far away from the front, and also a few places that were closer to the front but had blocked views, say like an ornamental hedge in the way or something. Parking a car, of course, also requires legal and physical access. So this kind of seaside promenade area, while a good place to put a car just for the shot, was out of question because there was no road access, at least not easy road access. We found a good backup location, but it was too far away from our other shooting locations. And finally, we spotted this slip road. Now it's out of the way, which means less bother from pedestrians, and it also solves a bit of a scheduling headache that we'd realized we had as well, because the scene is intended to take place at dusk, but because this is out of direct sunlight throughout the day, some careful framing and a little bit maybe of additional lighting would allow us to have a more flexible schedule, which is fab because we're working with young actors in this instance who have limited working hours. Now I know it sounds like a simple thing, but that's a classic example of location scouting, which involves juggling all sorts of competing priorities. As always, you want to start with what you actually want, a place to park a car with a sea view. Then you eliminate things that won't work for that, which in this case is parking spaces without the view. Then you think about the practical. Can I actually physically do what I need to do in this location? And that ruled out our promenade space. Then there's a broader question, which is what would this choice mean for the shoot day itself? How far is it from our base? Will it require a full unit move when we move all of the crew from one place to another? Is it too busy or is it too quiet? And finally, hopefully, you end up with a few options and you think through your decision until you find the right balance of practical and aesthetic considerations, which might include rethinking some of the elements of the scene. Just to note, these considerations change at different budget levels and with different amounts of prep time. If you're doing a Hollywood movie, you might be able to park the car where you like and just raise it up on a trailer to get the sea in shot. Generally, independent film means having less choices like that, although you can imagine certain cases where actually you need much less space for an indie film, so you might be able to use something a little bit more out of the way. That's just an example. Now this list of questions, it can be used as a basic checklist when you're scouting. Once you've found your locations, you need to work out where your unit base will be. A unit base is basically where the cast and crew gather when they're not needed on screen, or where they just go to do, well, basically anything. It's your canteen, it's your office, it's your equipment store. If you're shooting in a big enough building, this will probably just be a different room that won't be used in the film. But if, like our beach day, you're shooting outside pretty much all day, your unit base is vitally important. So here's our chosen locations plotted out on a map. And ideally, we move the crew as little as possible. And that includes taking them back and forward to the unit base for things like equipment changes or going to the toilet even. All of that stuff takes up time, and it also, in terms of moving things, takes up energy, which you really want to use on the film instead. And another thing to think about here is parking. I know it's boring and practical, but even on the most small-scale, eco-friendly shoot, you can probably have a car or van carrying equipment. And that means that you need a parking space. You need somewhere to go that's safe and hopefully not too expensive. Now, I've talked extensively about exteriors, but of course interiors are important too. And happily, the checklist still kind of broadly applies. And one last thing, if you really want to please your camera department, when you're scouting, make sure to check how much power there is in a location, where you can get it from, and the compass directions for your location. If the windows in your interior are east facing, then that's very different for the schedule than if they're west facing. You literally might need to flip your schedule completely opposite to accommodate natural light, because it can save a lot of time. And adequate power, of course, is really important for lighting and, well, for all sorts of stuff. Crew needs to charge their phones as well, right? And another thing that's really useful for interior locations is a floor plan, because it allows the cinematographer and the production designer to think through a bit more things like, how big is the furniture or the light stand? Is there enough space for it where I want to put it? You'll also want to take plenty of photos of your locations for the same reasons, because it really helps to communicate to members of crew who aren't there, except on the actual shoot day itself, what the space is like. That's all from me on location scouting, but I hope you find these tips useful for your next film. Have a good one, and I'll see you next time. Bye for now.